guys, Otterpop here, and welcome to another Dan vs. review. This is going to be the review for Season 1, Episode 6, Dan vs. Canada. So, I apologize for any of the weirdness of some previous reviews. It's still a little bit of a learning curve. I was changing things up with the reviews this time, but I think I've got the general formula now. So, firstly, a very quick recap of the episode. So, there's a little more to it than this, but after dealing with a bad comic, some Canadian geese, and maple syrup, Dan vows vengeance on Canada, and he takes Chris with him, who apparently has a little bit of Canadian in him. So the first little bit / Easter egg that I'm going to be talking about in this video is actually, before the title card even appears, is the comics that Dan ends up getting from a comic book store, which is apparently not far from his home. But included in those comics is one called Population Control Johnny, which is actually a little bit of a reference to Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, which was actually made by the creator of Invader Zim before he started working on Invader Zim, but it was just a little funny because I'm like, what the heck is this? And as soon as I started looking at the comic, I'm like, wow, this is basically reminiscent of like Invader Zim, and sure enough, it was the same guy who created it just before he actually created the actual show, and I'm like, oh, okay then. But another interesting little tidbit about a comic, or at least I particularly found it a little bit interesting, was that while he was looking at the comics that he had apparently purchased from this comic book store, he complains about the third Canadian comic or something like that, where the character has no dark side, no inner rage, no enemies, and, you know, they have kindness as a friggin' superpower of all things. Personally, I saw it more as like a manifestation of Dan's, like, angry, raging, pessimistic, whatever you would call it, personality, but I also wonder at the same time if he's got just a little bit of sense of taste, because I, as a writer, as a story writer, I write usually fantasy, but me as a writer myself, I tend to avoid characters like that too, so I actually kind of agreed with him on that. That was just a little smaller thing that I kind of personally thought about, but, you know, just saying. But I swear to goodness, I'm going to be questioning this every single freaking episode, questioning Dan's intelligence and his abilities in this nonsensical cartoon, whatever it is. Like, when he's talking about, you know, how Canada was, you know, England and France had a baby out of wedlock, and that was Canada. And I was thinking to myself at the time, like, I mean, that was worded really weird, but not completely wrong. I mean, he's not, but it was still worded really weird, because, you know, in a bizarre way, it is kind of partially true. Like, there were all kinds of expedition fights and races between England and France when they were, you know, first settling into the territories of what is now the United States and as well as Canada. And there was the 7 Years' War that kind of started the whole... I mean, it didn't start the tradition between, you know, England and France fighting a lot, but it definitely culminated into that big old fat war that would eventually kind of lead into the Revolutionary War. And then apparently Dan knows that Canada has a prime minister because he referred to Chris as such, but he doesn't realize also that you can't just add 1/16 and 10/16 to make a whole 16/16. That's not how math works. I mean, maybe he just knows a little bit about history and just sucks at math or something, but I don't know. His intelligence just continues to astound and confound me all at the same time. And then, of course, it's not just Dan's mental, I hate that I'm even saying this, mental prowess that's astounding sometimes. It's even his physical abilities that are surprising from time to time. It's a little bit tricky to explain, but later on in the episode, when Chris is riding a bear going up a vertical cliff, and all Dan is doing is just hanging with his arms onto Chris's shirt. Like, that's all he's doing, is just hanging onto Chris with his freaking hands, and I'm just like, you have the strength to do that? You seem so puny and scrawny, but I don't know. I feel like I'm just going to be questioning Dan's intelligence and his physical ability throughout the entirety of this series, because sometimes it just doesn't make sense. I mean, I get that maybe sometimes it's cartoon logic, but at the same time I'm like, no, I gotta question it, because that's how I am. I'm analytical. But overall, this episode definitely seemed to be a very Chris-centric episode, as well as a little bit of a Dan and Chris relationship-centric episode. I mean, I'll get into the relationship a little bit later, but first I'm going to talk about Chris, because we actually learn a lot about him. Like, a lot. One of them being his family. I mean, because, you know, he apparently has Canadian in him. He is 1/16 Canadian. I still question that math, though, because I made a comment about it in my freaking reaction, because Chris specifically said his great-great-grandfather, who was Canadian, who had a wife and son. He specifically said that. but the math just doesn't add up. I do not care if I'm talking about this again in my review because something just does not sit right with me. If you have one parent who is Canadian and another who's not, then you would be half Canadian. If you have one grandparent, that would be 1/4 Canadian. And I'm using my fingers to go up generations. If you have a great-grandparent who is Canadian, you would be 1/8 Canadian. And a great-great-grandparent who is Canadian, 1/16. That kind of makes sense. Except for the fact that the great-great-grandfather had a son. He had a son who was born in Canada. Even if he grew up in America for most of his life, he is still technically Canadian, meaning that Chris is 1/8 Canadian. I don't care that I'm making a big deal about this, because as soon as I see that there's potential error in math that is just this freaking big and obvious, I have to say something. Am I missing something? I don't think I'm missing something. And I'm sorry that I'm overreacting, but errors in math irk me. But whatever, I digress. Chris is 1/16 Canadian. Kind of makes you wonder what else he is. I mean, that's still 15/16, technically 7/8. That's still like, what the heck could it be? Although it is a little bit of a fascinating concept to think about, because Dan, multiple times over the course of the episode, keeps telling Chris that he seems more and more Canadian by the minute, hour, day, or whatever, which actually kind of holds true. I mean, based on Canadian stereotype anyway, because, I mean, yeah, Chris seems to become a lot more passive over time, but he also seems a lot more at ease. I mean, I couldn't have been the only one who noticed that. He really does seem a lot more at ease the further along the episode goes. The more, like, he seems more and more calm as time goes on. I mean, I could just be overlooking it, but that's what I noticed. And of course, there are some other little interesting Canadian tidbits, like the voice actor for Chris, I think his name is Dave Foley, is actually from Canada. He's actually a Canadian voice actor. And the real Chris Pearson, the whole axe murderer story that was brought up in the episode with, Chris's great-great-grandfather being out of the woods for so long that he came back, his wife had remarried, and attempted to axe murder his family or something like that. Apparently that was a true story relating to Chris's great-grandfather, or at least some of it's true. I can't exactly remember how much of it was true. I'm suddenly forgetting, but apparently some of it was true, and I'm just like, wow, family problems much? I mean, I know my family has problems from time to time, and we are definitely weird, and did you actually guys know that I am actually related to Anne Frank on my dad's side? I'm not even joking about that. My dad's great-grandfather was second cousin to Anne Frank's father, Otto. I'm not even joking about that. So I guess you learn something new every day, but, every family's got their weird, ancestry. So I guess Chris, in real life Chris, as well as the cartoon Chris, have their families. But it's not just Chris's family that got a little bit of a spotlight in this particular episode. I mean, I've also kind of looked a little bit about Chris's physical ability. I'd mentioned Dan's earlier, but there was a lot more interesting things that happened with Chris's particular physical ability. So, like, the first time we actually, see him having some potential strength is, he goes to punch Dan and punches a rock instead, and it makes a really big crack in it. I'm like, wow, okay, he's got some surprising strength. And not only that, but later on in the episode, Chris ends up carrying a big old grizzly bear and Dan across a river, suggesting even further his potential strength. He can carry a bear and Dan across the river. Okay, I guess that's something now. Not only that, but he's also potentially a good ice skater too. He and Dan end up at an ice skating rink at some point in the episode, and Chris is reciting, some ice skating moves and is skating with pretty good balance and ease. It was kind of surprising. And then there was the very end of the episode. Chris, due to being 1/16 Canadian, can turn into a bear. He can turn into a bear. He can turn into a bear. I wish I was joking about that, but he can. I have no idea if something like this will ever get brought up again in a future episode, but that happened. There was definitely a lot to learn about Chris in this particular episode, but something else that should not go unmentioned is the relationship that was especially established and, put together between Chris and Dan. It was on full display here. Elise was hardly in the episode, but that doesn't matter because the episode is not trying to focus on her. It is trying to focus on Chris and Dan. I mean, they are kind of, out of their usual hometown, so it partially makes sense. But their relationship definitely gets a lot of attention in this particular episode. Like, for instance, when Chris and Dan were trying to get over an electrified fence, and Chris was trying to, break the electrified fence with I don't know what that snipping tool is. Is it just a snipper? I don't know. I feel like there's another name for it, but I digress. Chris gets electrocuted a minimum of 4 times. A minimum of 4 times. For Dan's sake, of all things. It really questions their relationship at that point. Especially, it makes you wonder why Chris would put up with Dana's antics. Why he would force himself or why he would allow himself, rather, to get electrocuted. I mean, little shocks, I guess, but because he didn't pass out or anything along those lines. But why he would allow himself to get electrocuted multiple times for Dan's revenge plans, for Dan's sake, basically. And again, it feels like, especially in this episode, their relationship status, whatever you might want to call it, just kind of went back and forth. Like, first there's the electrocution, and then the two of them are in the woods at night, alone, and Chris starts to tell the story about his great-great-grandfather. He's still 1/8 Canadian, I'm just saying that right now. And Dan is like, oh, you really think that I want to hear that dumb story? And Chris pauses, and then he just continues with the story anyways. I like to think of it a little bit as Chris getting revenge by not caring what Dan thinks and telling the story anyways, but it was still kind of nice to see Chris get a little bit of justice, in a sense. It really was. And then there was a bit of a fight between Chris and Dan later in the episode when they were in a hospital, and Chris, honestly, he looked so mad by the end of that argument. Like, they just kept arguing with one another for at least a hot minute. And Chris got so mad that he actually started going for the door and going to open it and leave. I'd never seen him so mad before. But then he stops, and then he's like, and then he turns around and he ends up helping Dan with his plan anyways. Despite what Dan keeps putting him through, not even just the electrocution, but anything from previous episodes and any events that have happened off screen that we haven't seen yet. And Chris still puts up with this. And he still goes off to help Dan with his freaking revenge plan. I mean, Chris, you are 1/8/1/16 Canadian, and you're gonna help Dan get revenge on your ancestral home? Why? Why do you do this? Maybe it's more evidence to Chris being a bit of a doormat and a pushover. I'm not entirely sure, but either way, Chris, by the end of the episode, it was different compared to previous episodes. Chris has often been fairly reluctant and hesitant to help Dan with his plans, and has even tried to stop Dan on a couple of occasions from him doing some very bad / borderline illegal or definitely illegal stuff. But instead, by the end of it, Chris is absolutely all for helping Dan, trying to get revenge on Canada by hitting the weak spot of a glacier, so there'll be a massive glacial melt storm avalanche thing from this big freaking glacier that apparently his great-great-grandfather knew about. But Chris is all on board for it. And he actually helps Dan in the very end of the episode. He's all for it. It's the first time that Chris has been completely willing to help Dan with one of his revenge schemes, and I'd never seen him like that before. Even today, I still have never seen him like that before. I mean, at this point, I just kind of see it as like a true culmination of what their friendship can really be and what it looks like at its strongest, in a positive way, not a negative way. There's still probably some more that we have yet to see, when their friendship takes the hardest hit and just basically hits rock bottom. But it just, the scene and especially the end of the episode really stood out to me because it was the first time that, Chris had fully agreed to help Dan with one of these crazy plans, obviously, but it showed how unusually strong their friendship was. It still made me question how and why it worked, but clearly it had a very clear strength to it, and in the most positive of a way. I was honestly really surprised, and I think it my own way, I was kind of rooting for them, but just a little bit. It's still revenge against an entire freaking country. First it was a state, now it's a freaking country. Oh, is Dan gonna go after the whole Earth now? Definitely a Chris-centric episode, and definitely a central episode on the relationship between Dan and Chris. Because it seems like it's at its strongest here. And I'm not sure why. Like, I still have a bunch more episodes to see. But it feels like that this right here is the strongest their friendship ever will be. I don't know, well, ever will be that I've seen so far, I guess, or maybe that's seen in the show. Maybe there's some stronger moments that are off-screen from before Wolfman even started happening. But this is the strongest evidence of their relationship in a positive way in the show thus far. Again, there's still plenty more episodes, but I don't know. I don't know how the ending of this one could particularly top. I don't know how anything could particularly top what happened in the end of this episode. And then, of course, there's the obvious, plenty of Canadian stereotypes out there. Like, Canadians are super nice, they have, their funny accents. I would know, trust me. My grandfather does have a slight bit of, like, a semi-Canadian accent sometimes. He's from Minnesota, so it kind of makes sense. But, sorry and, saying A at the end of every sentence. Their accent is, pretty defined. I also could have sworn that this was a little bit of a Canadian stereotype with, everybody being like, half bear and, super strong and hardened to the wilderness or something like that. I don't remember for sure if that specifically was a stereotype. And then, of course, there was a mention of Canada's hospitals not charging patients, but that's more a difference with the Canadian system than the American system, so it's not really a stereotype, but it is a little bit of a Canadian-ish reference. There's all the French people that live in Canada, whether they like it or not, I actually don't know for sure. I mean, I know that there are a lot of Canadians and a lot of French Canadians. Whether the French/French Canadians enjoy living there, I'm not entirely sure if they do or don't, and what the stereotype might be, if there actually is one. And then, of course, Canadians love for ice hockey, because they live in a frozen wilderness, not so much wasteland, but just wilderness, full of snow and ice, and glaciers. Glaciers that could create endless winter, or something like that. But still, overall, strong episode, strong evidence of the truly most powerful that the relationship can be between Chris and Dan. I'm still interested in seeing if it can be shown that it can be stronger in some way, shape, or form, or if it can be tested and can hit rock bottom. Because I think both are possible. I mean, we have to see a rock bottom episode at some point, right? I feel like we should. Whether or not their relationship will be stronger, if we do see evidence of that, it better be a good freaking episode. I'm just saying that right now. But I think that is all that I have for this particular review, so... Oh crap. I once again forgot to mention that the link to the reaction is going to be down in the description below. Ugh. I'm so bad at remembering that. I apologize. But I hope you enjoyed both the reaction and the review. I hope you found them interesting or entertaining, or maybe they were bad. I'm not entirely sure. But as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.